New requirements by MDR are frequently analyzed on the level of nitty-gritty details. This is important, but sometimes we lose coherence. This video is intended to provide some comments from a general view on clinical evaluation for the upcoming medical device regulation to be considered when diving deep into the details. Despite the recent delay of MDR implementation, it is highly recommended to prepare for that to avoid overload of resources and processes. Particularly collection and processing of clinical data, which require significant time for adaptation, are already addressed in MEDDEV 2.7/1 Revision 4 and applicable now. It is possible to implement core aspects of MDR even now and reduce the need for change when it comes to formal submission for MDR CE certificates. Reply of many experts at medical device industry indicate concerns that devices will not be able to receive MDR certificates due to lack of clinical data. This is not true, as it reflects the traditional way to use of sample-based clinical studies as main source. This cartoon reflects the reality under present requirements much better. There are plenty of applicable clinical data out there. They just have to be harvested and processed, which is a challenge. So what has changed? Sample-based clinical studies, in general published in peer-reviewed journals, are still an important source for clinical evaluation. Higher requirements on quality and transferability might reduce the quantity of applicable studies, while the quality of clinical evidence probably will increase. Systematic reviews are a new source. It means basically, if experts have already made a structured assessment of evidence related to devices or technologies, it shall be considered. If the authors of a CER agree with the conclusions of the review, this can reduce their burden by avoiding redundant activities. In case of disagreement, this shall be justified. It might be considered that the aim of these independent assessments of evidence might be different from the one of regulatory processes. This can lead to different conclusions on the same basic data. Please note that guidelines or consensus statements by research societies are limited to state-of-the-art. Statements on individual devices are exclusively dedicated to the responsible company, presented in the CER to be assessed by the notified body. Register reports are an additional and new source of clinical data. This includes, in fact, real-world evidence and market experience in its wider view. Definitions and guidance for use of registries are harmonized on global level by the IMDRF Patient Registries Working Group, which published 3 documents. The definition of AHRQ is accepted globally. It might be considered that FDA and other regulators have adapted a very similar approach to the European Union by MDR concerning the use of real-world evidence data. Consequent efforts to adapt to MDR requirements are beneficial not only for Europe, but also to be in line with regulatory requirements on other global markets. The definition of registries covers a wide spectrum of real-world evidence and big data. Some examples are quality registries, which are well known and operational with great success since decades in various countries in orthopedics or cardiology, for example. Administrative routine data collection in healthcare for reimbursement, internal documentation by healthcare providers, both in hospitals and outpatient, as well as data collection and processing by healthcare authorities. Any active medical device produces data when in use. This data can be downloaded and processed if the device allows that. This applies also to software as medical device. The entire sector of telemedicine, which includes apps, remote control of devices, and monitoring by physicians. Surveys, both by internet and hard copies, for example performed by sales representatives. Cohort studies, like the Framingham Heart Study, a prototype for cohort studies and processes for data analysis. Summarizing these new opportunities, we're talking about big data analysis. Every day, huge amount of data is collected by the use of medical devices in global healthcare systems. This could be a valuable source of additional clinical data for legacy devices too, as it is possible to use available data in retrospect, based on an evaluation protocol following general scientific standards. In fact, implementation of these new requirements most probably will lead to development of Industry 4.0 processes in medical device industry. This will change workflows and operations in many companies. For example, the clinical and regulatory department will be involved in additional efforts of interpretation of data collected and documentation when the advantages of Industry 4.0 processes shall be realized for the success of the company. As this concept is already implemented successfully in other industries, like aerospace, automotive, or retail, since more than a decade, there are best practice models and experts available to support the adaptation to meet regulatory requirements for medical devices. Use of all clinical data applicable and robust evidence will allow to build PMCA cycles for continuous improvement of the device and its use on the market. This can be executed via risk management processes and will provide evidence on process and decisions for inspection by notified bodies and other third parties. Please note that use of clinical data and advanced risk management is addressed in several parts of MDR. It appears likely that processes for device development over its entire life cycle will become more structured and based on teams rather than performed by one individual expert. Let's have a look on a practical example. AEDs are defibrillators used in public places by lay users. Another market for these risk class 2 devices are ambulances, where they are used by trained personnel, often not on the level of physicians. This might trigger the need for evaluation on individual user groups. As there are many devices spread over public places, like railway stations or large buildings, and the individual device is rarely used, conventional studies face significant limitations due to operational reasons. To place a sufficient number of observers or study nurses at the devices waiting months or years for one event, and facing problematic circumstances for data collection when this emergency setting finally takes place, create a lot of well-justified critical questions. MDR and MEDDEV 2.7/1 Revision 4 open another approach to meet the higher requirements on clinical data. MDR requires an indicative list of parameters where the manufacturer defines how it intends to measure relevant endpoints for safety and performance. One might expect, for example, premature battery failure or release of shocks in an incorrect way on that list. If the device saves such data when used and allows a download at regular services, it might provide high-quality data by reasonable investments and efforts for data collection via maintenance logs. This data collected could become a main source for post-market surveillance. This is no innovative procedure. Car manufacturers perform like this since more than a decade. Key for use for regulatory purposes is a sound and objective process of evaluation and to cover a representative sample of the market. The options for clinical data provided by MDR also has some implications on the appraisal of evidence. Randomized clinical trials, the gold standard of prospective sample-based clinical studies, have an advantage to eliminate bias like selection bias or documentation bias. It's focused on the internal validity, so to eliminate confounders in the study setting, created by the sample and the study environment. Registries focus on external validity, so to reflect the real-world situation. Requirements like search for previously unknown side effects, off-label use or misuse can only be covered by registries in a reasonable way. There are statistical and methodological considerations. For example, rare events are better covered by large-scale real-world evidence data, while for confirmatory conclusions on a hypothesis, well-designed sample-based studies are in general superior. Poorly designed follow-up studies, a large proportion of clinical evidence used now, combine shortcomings on both ends. Internal validity due to limitations in study design, and external validity due to small sample size and lack of information if the study is conducted under conditions reflecting the average patient service. Consequently, they likely will become less attractive as source of clinical data and evidence. From a process perspective, clinical data represents a final validation of the entire process. It shows the cumulative effect on the patient or user concerning safety and performance. In case of a finding root cause analysis is expected, it appears reasonable that final validation obtains special attention when the final goal of updated regulatory requirements is to improve quality in outcome and reduce harm to patients and end users. It is not intended to produce basically new processes in quality management by MDR. Aim is to create better results on existing risk management processes by superior quality of information to be processed. MDR and MEDDEV 2.7/1 Revision 4 require in some aspects disruptive changes, in other issues a more innovative approach of development. However, clinical evaluation will have a central impact on regulatory processes and other processes inside a company. There are essential changes ahead. But even if it appears very confusing sometimes, the changes are not entirely new. From an overall perspective, the new regulation increases the requirements on clinical data, but it also provides opportunities to meet them by implementing processes which are accepted widely as a prerequisite for success in our modern world, driven by IT and data. Charles Darwin is still right. The way to adapt to new circumstances will have a significant impact on everyone's success. This book provides support to manage this topic from a practical perspective without losing the connection to legal texts and references.